Something unusual is happening in the NFL and most fans aren't noticing. Shedeur Sanders is being questioned, criticized, and analyzed, yet the voices inside his locker room tell a completely different story. Why does the media narrative clash so sharply with reality? Today, we uncover the truth behind the headlines. Something unusual is happening in the NFL right now, and most fans haven't fully noticed it yet. Shedeur Sanders has been under the microscope for months. Critics say he's not ready, question his leadership, and suggest he lacks focus. Every week it feels like another rumor, another hot take, another media voice repeating the same negative story. And for a while, people just accepted it. That's how narratives are built. Repeat a story enough times, and suddenly it feels like fact. But here's the twist. The people who actually share the field with Sanders are telling a completely different story. Respected veterans inside the locker room are praising his confidence, his work ethic, and the energy he brings every single day. Garrett, one of the league's most respected defensive leaders, has openly talked about the presence Sanders commands. Denzel Ward, another cornerstone of the team, has repeatedly highlighted Sanders' dedication and attitude. These aren't casual opinions, they're voices from players who see everything behind closed doors. And yet the media narrative keeps clashing with reality. Analysts like Kurt Warner, a Hall of Fame quarterback, have praised Sanders' football IQ and decision-making on the field. Instead of acknowledging that expertise, some critics dismiss it because Warner isn't inside the locker room every day. Meanwhile, anonymous sources and unverified rumors continue to dominate headlines, despite offering far less insight than actual teammates. Fans started noticing this contradiction. They began questioning why praise from credible, first-hand sources is ignored while speculation and assumptions are amplified. Clips surfaced showing Sanders sitting front row in team meetings, directly countering earlier critiques that he wasn't engaged. Every new piece of evidence adds another layer to the story and exposes the gap between media reports and locker room reality. What's happening here isn't just about one quarterback, it's about how narratives are created and controlled in sports media. The louder, repeated story often wins regardless of the facts, but when fans begin comparing headlines with real footage, player statements, and expert breakdowns, the conversation shifts. Suddenly, the debate isn't just about Sanders' skills or readiness, it's about credibility, perspective, and who gets to define the story. And that's where things get interesting, because the moment fans start looking closer, the narrative begins to crack and questions multiply. How much of what you're hearing is reality and how much is just repeated assumption? The tension between perception and truth is only growing, and everyone is starting to pay attention. While the media narrative around Shedeur Sanders kept repeating, something else was quietly unfolding inside the Browns' locker room. Players who actually see him every day were sending a very different message. Respected veterans weren't questioning his readiness, they were praising it. Garrett, one of the league's most respected defensive leaders, has openly talked about Sanders' confidence and the energy he brings to every practice. Denzel Ward, another cornerstone of the team, echoed similar sentiments, highlighting Sanders' leadership and focus. These aren't casual endorsements, they come from players who see the work behind the scenes, who practice, prepare, and win alongside him every day. Suddenly, a contradiction appeared. On one hand, commentators and analysts were claiming Sanders wasn't ready or focused. On the other hand, the players inside the building were telling a story of dedication, intelligence, and leadership. The more fans paid attention, the more this contrast became impossible to ignore. The voices of those in the locker room carried weight because they were witnessing everything firsthand. If Sanders wasn't putting in the work, these veterans would know. Yet week after week, the praise kept coming. And it wasn't just internal voices. Hall of Fame quarterback Kurt Warner, an experienced analyst and longtime student of the quarterback position, broke down Sanders' mechanics, decision-making, and football IQ, offering public validation of his potential. Instead of acknowledging this expertise, some critics dismissed it because Warner isn't in the locker room daily. Meanwhile, anonymous sources and speculative rumors continued to dominate headlines, gaining more attention than the people actually playing with Sanders. The tipping point came when fans started noticing the gap themselves. Clips surfaced showing Sanders sitting front row in team meetings, directly contradicting earlier critiques that he wasn't engaged or leading. Every new detail reinforced a growing question. Why does praise from credible, first-hand sources get ignored while assumptions and repeated rumors dominate coverage? This isn't just about one quarterback anymore. It's about perspective, credibility, and the power of narrative. When the people on the field, those who know him best, say one thing but the media repeatedly says another, fans naturally start digging deeper. They begin comparing statements, footage, and interviews. They notice patterns and contradictions. They start asking questions the media wasn't expecting. The locker room voices had shifted the story without even trying. Sanders wasn't just proving his skill on the field, He was exposing how easily narratives can be built, repeated, and questioned, and fans are watching every moment, ready to see which side of the story will hold up next. As the Sanders story unfolded, one thing became impossible to ignore: contradictions were everywhere. Analysts and commentators repeated the same critiques week after week. He was too flashy, not focused, more about his brand than football. But every time these claims surfaced, fresh evidence quietly undermined them. Fans started seeing it, and suddenly the narrative didn't feel so airtight. One of the earliest and most striking contradictions involved Rex Ryan. The former coach publicly suggested Sanders needed to sit closer to the front during team meetings to show engagement. It sounded like a serious critique. Yet within days, footage appeared online showing Sanders already sitting in the exact spot Ryan had said he needed to occupy. The response online was immediate. Fans began questioning the validity of that criticism. How did it even enter the conversation if the evidence showed otherwise? Then came Hall of Famer Kurt Warner. A quarterback with decades of experience, Warner publicly praised Sanders' mechanics, football IQ, and decision-making. He broke down film, highlighting the same qualities that critics claimed were missing, but instead of recognizing Warner's expertise, some commentators dismissed his analysis. "He's not in the locker room every day," they said, yet anonymous sources with no direct access to Sanders were treated as gospel. The inconsistency was glaring, and fans noticed. Even locker room reports added to the contradictions. Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward, two of the most respected leaders on the team, continually spoke positively about Sanders' focus, confidence, and energy. Every positive voice seemed to clash directly with the narrative pushed on television and radio. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Sanders' skill, it was about which voices got amplified and which were ignored. What made the situation even more fascinating was how quickly fans caught on. Social media, forums, and call-ins to sports radio began highlighting these contradictions. Each new clip or statement added a layer of doubt to the prevailing narrative. Fans started comparing analyst opinions with locker room observations and hard evidence from practice and games. The contrast was undeniable. At this point, the conversation had evolved. It was no longer a simple debate about a rookie quarterback. It became a discussion about credibility, media bias, and how quickly narratives can form and spread. When praise from proven, credible voices is dismissed while speculation dominates headlines, fans naturally begin questioning the system itself. And that's exactly what's happening with Sanders. Each contradiction exposed, each narrative challenged adds momentum to the larger story. Fans are watching, analyzing, and deciding for themselves. The story is no longer controlled by a few loud voices, it's alive, evolving, and unpredictable. Once fans started paying closer attention, the entire conversation around Sanders began to shift. What had once been a one-sided narrative driven by commentators and media voices suddenly met resistance. Callers to sports radio shows began asking simple but powerful questions that no one expected. If Sanders was truly such a problem, why were respected veterans in the locker room praising his leadership and energy? Why were players who shared the field with him every day speaking positively, while the media relentlessly questioned his work ethic and focus? These questions cut straight to the heart of the contradictions, and fans noticed immediately. The pushback was subtle at first, just a few voices challenging the narrative online. But the ripple effect was enormous. Social media posts dissecting game footage, highlighting Sanders' reads, and comparing what insiders said versus what was being reported started gaining traction. Fans weren't just talking, they were investigating. They cross-checked analyst commentary, locker room statements, and even clips from practices and meetings. Every new piece of evidence that contradicted the prevailing narrative became fuel for debate. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't controlled by a handful of loud voices anymore. A major turning point came when fans began citing specific examples. They referenced Myles Garrett, one of the most respected defensive players in the league, who repeatedly highlighted Sanders' confidence and presence in the locker room. Denzel Ward, another veteran leader, also praised Sanders' attitude and influence on team morale. Fans contrasted these endorsements with media speculation, asking, if the people who actually practice with Sanders daily see him as a leader, why is the narrative still negative? This was a critical moment. Fans had created a new lens through which to view the story, and it completely flipped the script. Online forums and fan communities exploded with discussion. People started sharing video evidence, breaking down plays, and even analyzing how reporters repeatedly recycled the same criticisms over weeks. The narrative that had seemed unshakable was now under constant scrutiny. Every rumor was questioned. Every unverified claim was met with skepticism. Slowly, a broader understanding began to emerge. The story about Sanders wasn't just about his abilities or his character, it was about how easily narratives can be shaped, repeated, and accepted without proof. What made fan pushback so effective was consistency and attention to detail. They didn't just argue opinions, they compared facts. They examined interviews, film breakdowns, and first-hand locker room accounts. Each point made the critics' arguments look weaker, and the more people investigated, the more apparent it became that Sanders' story had been misrepresented for months. By the time the momentum built, it was undeniable. Fans had reclaimed part of the conversation. They were no longer passive consumers of media narratives. They were active participants, shaping public perception and forcing questions that commentators could no longer ignore. And this shift didn't just impact Sanders, it highlighted a bigger truth about sports media. When fans push back with evidence, the story can change entirely, and the loudest voices no longer dictate reality. Sanders' critics had underestimated the power of an informed audience. What started as whispers of doubt had grown into a movement questioning credibility, bias, and the very way sports stories are told. And as the season unfolds, the eyes of fans will only sharpen, watching each play, each interview, and each statement with scrutiny. The narrative is no longer theirs to control, it belongs to everyone paying attention. Even as fans began pushing back, the media narrative didn't just slow down, it shifted. Suddenly, every positive mention of Sanders was met with a new type of skepticism. Analysts who praised his football IQ, mechanics, and leadership suddenly had their credibility questioned. Kurt Warner, a Hall of Fame quarterback with decades of experience both on the field and as an analyst, broke down Sanders' game and highlighted his confidence and decision-making. By any measure, Warner's evaluation carried weight, yet some critics dismissed it, saying, "Well, he's not inside the Browns' locker room every day." That response exposed a pattern. The goalposts kept moving depending on who was speaking. When criticism appeared, even if unverified or based on a single source, it was broadcast widely and treated as headline news. But when praise appeared from respected veterans, analysts, or coaches, it was minimized, dismissed, or reframed. Fans quickly noticed the contradiction. If outside opinions are only valid when negative, and internal voices are only acknowledged when convenient, what does that say about the integrity of the narrative? People started comparing statements side by side, and the inconsistency became impossible to ignore. Another moment made this pattern even more obvious. Former coach and analyst Rex Ryan suggested Sanders needed to sit closer to the front during team meetings to show engagement. The comment sounded serious and sparked questions about Sanders' leadership, but video footage soon circulated showing Sanders already sitting at the front. Fans immediately questioned how such a disconnect happened. How could a critique be repeated widely when evidence proved the opposite? It wasn't just a minor oversight, it was a textbook example of how narratives are created and amplified, sometimes without fact-checking. The goalposts weren't only moving on praise, they were moving on criticism too. One week, analysts claimed Sanders lacked respect in the locker room. The next, when multiple players confirmed his leadership and influence, the argument shifted again. Now the praise supposedly didn't matter because supportive teammates always say nice things. Fans noticed a pattern. Criticisms evolved to fit the narrative, and accolades were conveniently discounted. Each adjustment only fueled more skepticism, prompting deeper analysis and discussion across social media, fan forums, and podcasts. What made this so fascinating wasn't just Sanders' performance, it was the broader lesson about how sports media operates. When repeated narratives gain traction, they can influence public perception even if the facts don't fully support them. Once fans start comparing the claims with actual evidence, locker room statements, video clips, game film, the cracks in the story become undeniable. And that's exactly what happened here. The constant shifting of the goalposts revealed the tension between narrative control and reality. By the time fans fully realized it, Sanders had become more than a young quarterback under scrutiny. He became a case study in media narratives, confirmation bias, and public perception. Every statement, every clip, every analyst evaluation was dissected and compared. The discussion transformed from simple criticism to an ongoing examination of how stories are shaped in the modern NFL landscape. Ultimately, the lesson was clear. When the media keeps moving the goalposts, fans start noticing, and once they do, they don't just accept the story anymore. They investigate, they analyze, and they hold the narrative accountable. Sanders' situation became a perfect storm, talent, attention, and controversy colliding with an audience that refused to be passive. And that makes the unfolding story around him impossible to ignore. As the season progressed, the spotlight on Sanders intensified, and every snap he took on the field became part of the ongoing narrative. Critics were watching for mistakes, waiting for any sign that the preseason hype might have been overblown. Fans, however, were digging deeper, comparing each play to past critiques, searching for patterns, and analyzing how his decisions reflected his football IQ. Suddenly, it wasn't just about whether Sanders could play, it was about whether the story surrounding him was accurate. Every game brought new moments that were dissected in real time. When Sanders read a defense flawlessly and adjusted his play at the line, analysts praised his awareness, but some critics framed it as luck or a small sample fluke. When he made a risky throw that paid off, supporters highlighted his poise under pressure. Detractors questioned his decision-making. Every performance became a battleground between perception and reality. The lens through which people evaluated him was no longer uniform. It had fractured between those who relied on media soundbites and those who studied film and first-hand accounts. Locker room insight continued to shape the discussion. Veterans like Garrett and Denzel Ward openly credited Sanders for his leadership and preparation. Fans started comparing these testimonies to the media's narrative of alleged disengagement, and the contrast was stark. Game after game, Sanders' on-field consistency began to reinforce what insiders had been saying for months. His confidence and preparation translated into measurable results. Yet the media narrative didn't collapse overnight. Instead, it morphed, twisting every success into a talking point for debate. This ongoing scrutiny had a unique effect. Sanders wasn't just performing under pressure from opponents. He was performing under the intense, relentless gaze of analysts, commentators, and a vigilant fanbase. Each touchdown, each read, and each subtle adjustment carried more weight than in a typical rookie season. Even a minor error was magnified, while precise execution was often underappreciated unless it fit a pre-existing storyline. Fans, however, increasingly trusted direct evidence, film breakdowns, player statements, and statistical analysis over recycled media commentary. The spotlight wasn't just shining on Sanders' talent, it was illuminating the inconsistencies in the narratives surrounding him. Off the field, every interview, press conference, and social media post became material for analysis. When Sanders spoke about his preparation or the team's goals, fans dissected his words, comparing them to his on-field performance. They were looking for alignment between what he said and what he did, and more often than not, the evidence backed up the positive assessments from his teammates. Analysts and fans began noticing that Sanders' confidence wasn't arrogance, it was preparation and understanding of his role. His ability to stay composed under scrutiny became a story in itself. By midseason, Sanders' performance had shifted the conversation significantly. He was no longer merely a young quarterback under media attack. He had become a case study in how perception, evidence, and narrative interact in modern sports. Each game, each highlight, each analysis reinforced a growing truth. The gap between what was being repeated in headlines and what was happening on the field was real, measurable, and impossible to ignore. Fans were no longer passive consumers, they were active participants, comparing footage, stats, and player insights, shaping their own understanding independent of talking heads. Ultimately, Sanders' time under the spotlight demonstrated more than his skill. It revealed how easily narratives can diverge from reality. Fans saw through the noise and began forming opinions based on evidence, not repetition. Every successful read, every decisive throw, and every leadership moment became a point of validation, proving that the story of a player isn't dictated by headlines, it's written on the field by the athlete and witnessed by those paying attention. And that's why Sanders' journey under scrutiny has become so compelling. It's a living example of performance, perception, and truth colliding in real time. As the conversation around Sanders unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a story about one quarterback. It was a case study in how narratives are created and spread in modern sports media. For months, a select group of voices controlled the dialogue. Commentators, radio hosts, and analysts repeated the same critiques over and over. Sanders wasn't ready, he was too flashy, he focused more on branding than football. At first, the casual fan accepted these statements as fact because repetition creates authority. But as more insiders and actual players spoke up, cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed narrative. It's fascinating to see how sports media works in cycles. When a bold claim is made, it spreads quickly. People share it, discuss it, and the story gains momentum almost regardless of evidence. But when fans actively engage, when they start asking questions, the momentum can shift. In Sanders' case, fans began noticing a disconnect between the criticism in headlines and what players inside the locker room were saying. Garrett and Denzel Ward, two of the league's most respected veterans, openly praised Sanders' leadership and focus. Suddenly, the narrative that had dominated airwaves for months started to look unstable. This isn't just about Sanders, it's about a system that thrives on drama and conflict. Sports media is built on attention, clicks, ratings, and engagement. Stories that spark debate get amplified. But when facts don't align with the story being told, a curious and informed fanbase starts to question everything. Fans aren't passive anymore. They're analyzing film, comparing statements, and highlighting contradictions. When Rex Ryan said Sanders needed to sit in the front row during meetings, fans checked footage and discovered he already did. That one simple piece of evidence caused people to question how many other critiques were founded on observation versus assumption. The bigger picture here is how narratives influence perception. In Sanders' case, early criticism created a lens through which every action was interpreted. A perfectly timed throw could be downplayed as luck, while a minor misstep became headline news. The story wasn't just about performance, it was about controlling the perception of performance. Once fans started digging, comparing on-field evidence to off-field commentary, the narrative began to lose its grip. It highlighted a fundamental truth. In sports, the story often matters as much as the statistics, but stories can mislead when they aren't grounded in reality. Another important layer emerged when outside analysts like Hall of Famer Kurt Warner weighed in. His praise of Sanders' decision-making mechanics and field awareness was met with skepticism by some critics, not because it was incorrect, but because Warner wasn't inside the Browns' locker room daily. This double standard raised eyebrows. Positive external evaluations were questioned, while negative opinions from similar sources were embraced. Fans noticed this inconsistency immediately, recognizing a pattern where controversy was more valuable than truth. By midseason, Sanders' story had evolved into a broader discussion. How much of what is consumed in sports media is shaped by evidence, and how much is designed to generate drama? Every fan, every analyst, and every player interaction contributed to this larger narrative experiment. The gap between on-field reality and media interpretation became a visible battleground. It wasn't just a debate about a quarterback's skills, it was a debate about credibility, influence, and the power of storytelling. Ultimately, Sanders' experience illustrates a modern sports phenomenon. Athletes today aren't just competing on the field, they're competing against narratives, rumors, and repeated critiques that may have little connection to reality. Fans are no longer passive, they are fact-checkers, analysts, and active participants. When a story like Sanders unfolds, it exposes the machinery behind sports media, showing how perception is manipulated, challenged, and ultimately reshaped. The Sanders saga isn't just about one player. It's a glimpse into the evolving relationship between athletes, media, and the public, where truth is constantly negotiated and attention is the ultimate currency. As the season continues, all eyes are on Sanders and the story is far from over. What started as a series of critical takes from media voices has now evolved into something much bigger. Fans, analysts, and players are all paying attention, and the narrative isn't controlled by a handful of commentators anymore. Every performance, every decision, and every interaction on or off the field is now under the microscope. The question isn't just whether Sanders can lead, it's whether the media narrative surrounding him can withstand scrutiny. One of the most fascinating aspects of this saga is how fans have become active participants. They're no longer passively accepting what gets broadcast on TV or radio. They're comparing quotes to game footage, they're analyzing practice clips, and they're looking at what players inside the locker room are actually saying. Miles Garrett and Denzel Ward have both publicly supported Sanders, emphasizing his confidence, leadership, and the energy he brings to the team. Analysts like Hall of Famer Kurt Warner have broken down his mechanics, decision-making, and football IQ. Each endorsement, each positive analysis, adds a layer of complexity to the narrative and forces critics to reconsider their positions. But it's not just about praise. The attention Sanders attracts also brings a magnifying glass to his every move. Every pass, every interaction with teammates, every press conference becomes part of the ongoing conversation. Fans are watching closely because they want to see how he responds under pressure, and whether the criticisms, fair or not, have any basis in reality. And that's where the tension lies. Sanders' story is no longer just about stats and touchdowns. It's about perception, credibility, and the way narratives shape how players are seen by the public. Media spotlight isn't going away, and that creates both opportunity and risk. For Sanders, this is a chance to prove his critics wrong and validate the confidence of his teammates. Every highlight play and every successful drive becomes more than a statistic. It becomes evidence in the larger discussion about his talent and leadership. Fans are invested, not just because they want their team to win, but because they're watching a real-time example of how sports narratives are made, challenged, and reshaped. At the same time, this situation has sparked a broader conversation about accountability in sports media. When repeated criticism doesn't match reality, fans notice. They question why certain voices are amplified while others are dismissed. When positive feedback from credible sources is ignored but criticism spreads rapidly, it exposes a pattern. Controversy drives attention, not truth. Sanders' journey highlights the importance of looking deeper, evaluating the facts, and forming an opinion based on evidence rather than repeated claims. Looking ahead, the fans' role will only grow. Social media. Highlight reels and locker room reports give them tools to challenge narratives in ways that weren't possible just a decade ago. Sanders' story has become a blueprint for how fans, players, and analysts interact in the digital age. Every game, every interview, and every analyst breakdown will be dissected, shared, and debated. The question is no longer, is Sanders ready? How will the next narrative unfold, and who will control it? For Sanders, the path is clear but challenging. His performance on the field is the ultimate answer. Consistency, leadership, and skill will speak louder than any headline. For fans, this is their moment to witness history as it unfolds. A young quarterback navigating expectations, media scrutiny, and the intense spotlight of the NFL. Every pass, every decision, every highlight will be analyzed, not just for football, but for what it says about perception, influence, and the power of narrative. And that's why nobody can afford to look away. The story of Sanders is ongoing, evolving with every game and every interaction. Fans are now co-authors of this narrative, challenging assumptions, demanding proof, and holding everyone accountable. In the world of modern sports, attention is the currency, and Sanders has become the center of a high-stakes conversation that's far bigger than just football. The season will reveal whether the critics were right, whether the fans' faith is justified, and whether Sanders can truly define his own story in the face of scrutiny. One thing is certain. The spotlight isn't fading and every moment matters.